We're about to embark on a compelling journey, one that plunges into the profound darkness of history, yet emerges with tales of resilience and radical transformation. Tonight, we'll step back to an age defined by the devastating sweep of the Black Death, exploring what it truly meant to live, and against all odds, to survive, humanity's deadliest plague. Settle in. Find a quiet moment and let your imagination transport you. This isn't just a recounting of facts, it's an immersive experience into a past that irrevocably shaped our present. Consider yourself a peasant in Europe, waking up in the crisp morning of 1347. Your eyes flutter open, the unfamiliar light filtering through a small, horn-paned window. You stretch on a thin, straw-filled mattress, each rustle a familiar sound. This isn't the comfort of a private chamber. You are in a single-room cottage, every family member a breath away from the next, their forms slowly stirring in the pre-dawn gloom. The walls, rough to the touch, are crafted from wattle and daub, a sturdy, if rudimentary construction, of woven wooden strips packed tightly with a mixture of mud, clay, and straw. Surprisingly effective at keeping out the biting cold, these walls have served your family for generations, though the thatched roof above sometimes weeps with heavy, relentless rain. As you rise, the air is thick with the interwoven tapestries of daily life, the lingering, comforting smoke from last night's hearth fire, now just embers glowing faintly, the damp, earthy scent of the packed dirt floor beneath your bare feet, and an inescapable, human tang, the distinct aroma of unwashed bodies. Bathing, you know, is a rare luxury in these medieval times, a seasonal event rather than a daily ritual, hindered by effort, cold water, and a lack of private facilities. Fortunately, no one truly notices, for everyone shares this same deep-seated smell of humanity, work, and the earth. Your belly emits a low, insistent grumble, a constant companion. Breakfast, if you're fortunate, might be a piece of leftover bread from yesterday, dense and coarse, likely hardened to a formidable brick overnight. You'd soften it in a bowl of weak ale, for even children partake in this fermented brew. It's not for pleasure, but for safety. The murky river water, often drawn from the same source where waste is discarded, is a known harbinger of illness, a peril far greater than the mild intoxication of a diluted drink. Outside your humble dwelling, the village is already shaking off the vestiges of night. The distant lowing of cattle, the urgent clucking of hens scratching for their morning meal, and the hearty calls of neighbors exchanging greetings blend into the familiar symphony of your world. Most here are peasants, their lives intrinsically linked to the land. Some are free tenants, paying rent to the lord of the manor for the privilege of working their plots. Others, like your own family, are serfs, bound to the soil, obligated to provide labor and service to the Lord in exchange for protection and a place to live. Life here follows an ancient, comforting rhythm. The sun dictates the hours, its daily arc the only clock. The toll of the church bells marks the passage of weeks, calling you to Mass and solemn prayer. The turning of the seasons, the cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting dictates the years. It is a demanding existence, certainly, dictated by weather, hunger, and the whims of your Lord. Yet it is the only life you have ever known, its predictability a form of solace. What you, or anyone else across the vast European continent, cannot possibly know is that this ancient rhythm is about to shatter. An unseen, insidious shadow is stretching its tendrils across the known world, destined to transform society in ways no war, famine, or political upheaval ever has. The first whispers of this coming cataclysm arrive not with a storm, but with a traveling merchant. He is a familiar sight, his pack laden with exotic goods, shimmering silks from the distant east, fragrant spices from lands beyond imagining, and intricate trinkets from bustling coastal cities. Villagers gather, their eyes wide with fascination, eager for news and a glimpse of the outside world. But this time, his usual goods are overshadowed by something else he carries: stories. Terrifying, breathless tales of a sickness laying waste to cities along the bustling trade routes, leaving thousands dead in its wake. A mysterious illness, he recounts, that strikes with a sudden fever, followed by agonizing swellings and almost certain death. Some villagers, clutching crosses to their chests, murmur prayers. Others, ever skeptical, dismiss the accounts as merchants' exaggerations, knowing that alarming rumors often travel faster and further than plain truth. The merchant moves on, and for a while, life in your village resumes its accustomed pace. Yet, the seeds of dread have been planted, and the rumors persist, growing more frequent, more detailed, and far more frightening with each passing month. By autumn, the whispers have escalated into shouts of alarm, carried on the wind by desperate travelers and merchants. The sickness, they confirm, has reached the Mediterranean ports of Europe: Messina, Marseille, Venice. Stories circulate of ships drifting into harbors, their sails slack, decks silent, filled with nothing but corpses. Sailors struck down during their journey, leaving ghost ships to bear their grim cargo. "God save us all," your mother murmurs, clutching you tightly as she hears the news, her fingers instinctively tracing the sign of the cross over her chest. In your village, people begin to prepare as best they can, though no one truly comprehends what they are preparing for. Some hoard meager stores of grain and salted meat. Others spend more time in the cold stone church, their voices rising in desperate pleas for divine protection. The local healer, an old woman with gnarled hands and a vast knowledge of forest remedies, gathers her herbs and concoctions, though a palpable fear hangs in her eyes. Whether any of her familiar remedies will hold power against this unknown affliction, she cannot say. The first cases reach your region in the biting cold of winter. A neighboring village, barely half a day's walk away, reports several sudden, inexplicable deaths. The victims, it is said, suffered from searing fevers, an unbearable thirst that left their mouths parched and cracked, and then, most horrifyingly, strange black swellings appearing in their armpits and groins. Few, if any, survived more than 3 agonizing days after the onset of symptoms. Your village elders convene, their faces grim, debating what course of action to take. Some argue for closing the village gates, severing all contact with the outside world, hoping to barricade yourselves against the unseen enemy. Others counter, asserting that trade and communication are vital arteries of survival, arguing that isolation would lead to starvation. In the end, indecision reigns, and life, driven by necessity, continues, though now permeated by a chilling undercurrent of pervasive fear. Then, one crisp morning, the young man who tends the mill fails to appear for his duties. His absence, usually unheard of, sends a ripple of unease through the village. When a neighbor, steeling himself, goes to check on the miller, he finds him burning with fever, his body drenched in sweat, his neck grotesquely swollen with a painful, angry lump the size of a hen's egg. The bubo. There is no longer any room for doubt, no more whispered rumors or distant fears. The plague has arrived in your village. What follows is a period of unrelenting horror, unlike anything the human mind could have possibly conceived. The sickness spreads with terrifying speed and indiscriminate cruelty. One day, a person is hale and hearty, working in the fields or gossiping by the well. The next, they are racked with fever, shivering uncontrollably. By the third day, more often than not, they are dead. The black buboes, those agonizing swellings that give the disease its dreadful name, the Black Death, are painful beyond human description, throbbing, weeping, and often turning a sickening black. Some victims begin to cough up blood, a terrifying sign that the disease has invaded their lungs, transforming them into walking vectors of contagion. These unfortunates rarely last more than a day or two, their last breaths rattling with bloody phlegm, spreading death with every gasp. "It's a punishment from God!" some shriek, their voices raw with terror and despair, as they join processions of flagellants, scourging their own backs with whips, hoping to appease what they believe is divine wrath for humanity's sins. "It's bad air," others claim, attributing the sickness to a foul miasma rising from swamps and unburied dead, carrying small posies of aromatic flowers and herbs to ward off the noxious fumes they believe cause the disease. A few, in hushed, sinister tones, darkly mutter, "It's the Jews, poisoning the wells." Though your village holds no Jewish residents, and such accusations make little logical sense, fear breeds irrationality and blame. The truth, which no one in the 14th century could possibly have known, is far more insidious and microscopic. The Black Death is caused by a tiny, rod-shaped bacterium called Yersinia pestis. This microscopic organism travels in the guts of fleas, which, in turn, hitch rides on the backs of rats. These rats, constant companions in medieval towns and villages, stowaways on ships, and uninvited guests in every home, unwittingly become the primary transporters of death across continents. When an infected flea bites a human, it regurgitates the bacteria into the wound. The bacteria then multiply rapidly, often overwhelming the body's defenses and causing painful swelling in the lymph nodes, those dreaded buboes. If the bacteria manage to reach the lungs, they cause pneumonic plague, an even more terrifying variant that can spread directly from person to person through the simple acts of coughing and breathing. But you, immersed in the terror of your time, know none of this. All you know is that people are dying, horribly and swiftly, and no one, from the most learned physician to the holiest priest, seems able to stop it. Your village, like thousands of others across Europe, is utterly transformed by the plague. The church bells, which once pealed to mark the hours, celebrate feast days, or call the faithful to prayer, now toll constantly, a monotonous, mournful dirge for the dead. Eventually, even this ceases. There are simply too many deaths to announce, too many souls departed, and the bells fall silent, their silence a heavier weight than their constant lament. The dead are buried quickly, unceremoniously, stripped of the elaborate funeral rites that once marked a person's solemn passage from this world to the next. Now, bodies are collected on rough carts, piled together, and carted off to mass graves, often dug shallow and hastily filled. Some families, completely annihilated by multiple deaths, have no one left to bury their loved ones, and bodies might lie in homes for days, bloating and decaying, until neighbors or overwhelmed parish officials dare to remove them. Fear, a contagion of its own, changes how people behave toward one another. Those with healthy family members might bar their doors and windows, refusing entry to anyone, even lifelong friends. Those whose relatives have fallen ill often find themselves ostracized, their homes shunned like pest houses. Some, seized by panic, flee to the countryside, hoping that distance will somehow protect them from the relentless disease. Others cling to religion with renewed, desperate fervor, processing through streets, flagellating themselves in public displays of penance, believing that God's terrible wrath can still be appeased. The priests, who should be a source of solace and spiritual guidance, are themselves dying in alarming numbers. Their sacred duties require them to administer last rites to the dying, constantly exposing them to the contagion. Many, overwhelmed by terror, abandon their flocks, fleeing their parishes in this time of humanity's greatest need, their absence a bitter blow to the dying and the grieving. Those brave or duty-bound enough to stay often succumb to the disease themselves, their final prayers choked by fever and buboes. Your family, remarkably, has been lucky. Though the plague rages all around, claiming friends and neighbors, none of your immediate household has yet fallen ill. You've heard the harrowing tales, entire families wiped out in neighboring villages, children orphaned only to perish themselves days later, lovers separated by death just hours after pledging eternal devotion. But your family's fragile luck cannot hold forever in a world where the Black Death eventually claims between a third and half of the entire population. Then, one morning, your younger brother complains of feeling unwell, his usual boisterous energy replaced by a listless pallor. By midday, his skin is burning with fever, his eyes glazed. By evening, the dreaded telltale swelling appears at his neck, hot and hard beneath your trembling fingers, and you know, with a sickening certainty, what it means. Your mother, a woman of indomitable spirit, tends to him day and night, her face etched with exhaustion and despair. She bathes his fevered brow with cool cloths, trying to coax sips of water or weak ale past his parched lips. Your father speaks of taking him to the monastery, a place of healing, where monks are said to treat the sick. But everyone knows the monasteries are overwhelmed, their cloisters filled with dying supplicants, many of the brothers themselves victims of the plague. For 3 agonizing days, your brother's condition worsens relentlessly. The bubo grows larger, turning an angry purplish red, then a terrifying bruised black. His breathing becomes ragged and labored, each shallow gasp a struggle. He cries out in pain and delirium, lost in fevered nightmares. You and your parents take turns sitting vigil by his straw pallet, the air thick with the metallic scent of sickness, though a primal fear makes you want to keep your distance, to flee this cursed place. On the 4th day, something utterly unexpected happens. While most plague victims at this stage succumb to the disease, your brother's fever breaks. He is terribly weak, his body a fragile shell, but his eyes are clear, his gaze lucid for the first time in days. The bubo remains, an ugly, throbbing mass, but it has softened somewhat. Over the next few days, it ruptures and drains, a disgusting but profoundly hopeful sign. Against all odds, your brother is one of the precious few who will survive the Black Death. What you and your family cannot know is the scientific marvel behind his survival when so many others perished. Modern science would eventually uncover a fascinating genetic secret. Certain individuals carry a specific genetic mutation dubbed Delta 32, which provides some degree of protection against the Yersinia pestis bacterium. This mutation affects a protein called CCR5, found on the surface of white blood cells, essentially making it much harder for the bacteria to enter and hijack these crucial immune cells. Your brother, and perhaps others in your family, may well carry this rare mutation. This genetic quirk, a random accident of nature, bestowed upon certain families and individuals a fighting chance against the deadliest pandemic in human history. And, in a strange twist of fate, centuries later, scientists would discover that this very same mutation also provides a degree of protection against another deadly disease, HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. The Black Death, in acting as a ruthless selector, inadvertently helped protect some of its descendants from a disease that would not emerge for another 600 years. But that is a story for another time, a distant future. For now, your family celebrates your brother's recovery as the undeniable, miraculous gift it truly seems to be. Not everyone, of course, is so fortunate. As weeks bleed into months, the plague continues its relentless, deadly work. Your village, which once boasted perhaps 200 souls, is now reduced to fewer than 100. Fields that were once meticulously tended now lie fallow and overgrown, their furrows consumed by weeds, as those who would work them are either dead or too consumed by caring for the sick or endlessly burying the dead. Even the lord of the manor, who resides in his formidable stone house on the hill overlooking the decimated village, has not been spared. He has lost his beloved wife and 2 of his children. Wealth and privilege, it turns out, offer no true shield against the indiscriminate wrath of the Black Death. And yet, strangely, some individuals seem almost immune to the plague, despite constant, intimate exposure. The village gravedigger, an unsavory, taciturn character known for pilfering trinkets from the dead before burying them, handles plague-ridden corpses daily, yet never exhibits a single symptom. A midwife, her hands deft and gentle, tends to the sick and dying when she isn't bringing new life into the world, yet she too remains inexplicably healthy, despite her dangerous work. Like your brother, they likely carry that same genetic protection, though medieval people would attribute their miraculous survival to divine intervention, or perhaps, in the case of the gravedigger, suspicious dealings with dark, infernal forces. Food becomes terrifyingly scarce as the harvest is neglected and vital trade routes dwindle to a trickle. The price of basic goods, a sack of grain, a piece of dried fish, soars to astronomical levels. Anything rumored to be a possible remedy, certain rare herbs, exotic treatments brought by desperate merchants, or even fragments of religious relics, becomes unimaginably expensive, if it can be found at all. As the biting cold of winter returns, the plague begins its temporary recession. This is not due to any human intervention or newfound cure, but rather the natural cycle of the disease. Fleas are less active in cold weather, and rats, their primary hosts, tend to huddle closer to their nests, limiting their spread. For a brief, fragile period, a collective sigh of relief ripples through the surviving population, a desperate hope that the worst has passed. But the Black Death is not finished. It merely retreats, only to return with a vengeful fury as the warming weather of spring awakens, finding new, vulnerable victims among those who survived the initial wave. Over the next 4 years, from 1347 to 1351, successive, devastating waves of plague will sweep across Europe, ultimately claiming somewhere between 75 and 200 million lives, perhaps half of Europe's entire population. The world that eventually emerges from this unfathomable catastrophe will be fundamentally and irrevocably changed. The massive population decline will rip apart the very fabric of the feudal system, dramatically increasing the value of labor and inexorably shifting power dynamics between the once subservient peasants and the once unassailable nobility. Religious authority will be severely questioned as people grapple with why their fervent prayers went unanswered and why so many priests abandoned their sacred duties in humanity's darkest hour. Medical knowledge, long based on ancient, revered texts and deeply ingrained superstition, will be challenged by the plague's stubborn defiance of all traditional treatments. For those who survive, individuals like your brother, the gravedigger, and the midwife, life will never, could never, return to what it was before. They are the fortunate ones, yes, but they carry the profound, lifelong burden of survival in a world of unimaginable loss. They will be the ones to rebuild societies, to renegotiate their relationships with authority, and gradually, painfully, to construct a post-plague world that, for better or worse, sets Europe on an unforeseen path toward modernity. But that is a story for tomorrow night. For now, as you drift toward sleep, imagine yourself as one of these medieval survivors, watching the first stars appear in the vast, inky evening sky above your quieted village. The plague has passed, at least for now. You have lived through humanity's darkest hour, a time of unprecedented suffering, and though you don't yet know it, you stand at the threshold of a new world, one born from the ashes of the old. The soft, even sound of your breathing mingles with the faint night sounds outside. A dog barking in the distant hushed village. The rustle of leaves in a gentle, almost mournful breeze. Despite everything, despite unimaginable loss and profound grief, life continues. And in that simple, enduring fact lies perhaps the most important lesson of the Black Death: humanity's remarkable, defiant capacity to endure, to adapt, and ultimately to carry on. The morning after your brother's miraculous recovery dawns with a strange mixture of emotions. A profound, overwhelming relief washes over your family, certainly, but it is tinged with something unfamiliar, a quiet, unsettling sense of wonder. Why was your family spared when so many others were not? This strange, pervasive survivor's guilt, this feeling of unworthiness amidst widespread suffering, will haunt many who live through this catastrophe, a silent scar on their souls. Your brother remains weak, his body fragile, but his eyes are clear, lucid for the first time in days. The drained bubo at his neck has left an ugly, angry scar that will mark him for life, a permanent, physical reminder of his terrifying brush with death. But a scar, you all know, is infinitely preferable to a grave, and your family treats each passing day of his slow, arduous recovery as the precious gift it truly is. One evening, as your mother lights a rush candle, casting flickering shadows across the humble cottage, your brother, his voice still raspy from illness, asks the question that weighs heavily on everyone's heart. Why did I live when so many died? Your mother pauses, the flame illuminating her weary face, before answering simply, God's will. Yet her tone, heavy with doubt, suggests she is not entirely convinced, grappling with the profound unfairness of it all. The truth, which no one in the 14th century could possibly comprehend, is far more intricate, a tapestry woven by the threads of biology and chance. Throughout human history, infectious diseases have served as powerful, albeit brutal, forces of natural selection. Those individuals possessing genetic advantages against specific pathogens survive at higher rates, passing these protective traits to future generations. The Black Death stands as perhaps the most dramatic and devastating example of this evolutionary process in all of human history. Deep within your brother's cells, and perhaps yours as well, lies a subtle genetic mutation that alters a protein called CCR5, found on the surface of white blood cells. This mutation, known as delta 32, creates a shortened, less accessible version of the protein, making it significantly harder for the plague bacterium to enter and hijack the immune cells. Some people possess one copy of this mutation, granting partial protection. A fortunate few carry two copies, bestowing upon them a substantial resistance to the disease. It is, quite literally, a genetic lottery, and your brother happens to hold a winning ticket. But the immense cost of this evolutionary advantage is measured in millions upon millions of lives. The lives of those without the protective mutation, who tragically succumbed to the relentless Black Death. As your brother slowly regains his strength, eventually venturing outside for the first time since his illness, you walk with him, observing how dramatically the familiar village has changed. Gardens that were once meticulously tended, their neat rows bursting with vegetables and herbs, now grow wild and untamed, choked by weeds. Houses stand eerily empty, their doors sagging, their owners either dead or having fled in terror. The once rhythmic sounds of daily work, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the incessant hum of the weaver's loom, the steady grind of the miller's wheel, are now muted or absent entirely, replaced by a haunting quiet. Yet, amidst this desolation, fragile but undeniable signs of human resilience begin to emerge. A market day is organized, smaller than before but vibrant with the determined energy of survivors clinging to life. Farmers from outlying areas, those who remain, bring what meager produce they've managed to harvest, their wagons rattling along dusty paths. A traveling merchant, braver or perhaps more foolhardy than most, arrives with precious salt, exotic spices, and news from distant, ravaged places. The news is consistently grim. Widespread devastation, followed by tentative, often painful, recovery. No place, it seems, has been entirely spared, though some have suffered far worse than others. Great cities, with their crowded conditions and abysmal sanitation, have been particularly hard hit, their populations decimated. A few small, isolated villages, nestled high in the mountains or deep within dense forests, have fared comparatively better, though even they have rarely escaped entirely untouched. In your immediate region, perhaps half the population has perished. In some places, the merchant recounts, the toll is even higher. He speaks of ghost towns where not a single soul remains alive, of once thriving monasteries where every monk lies dead in his cell, of ancient noble families wiped out entirely, their grand estates left without heirs, crumbling into ruin. But he also tells of glimmers of hope, of places where life continues with surprising, stubborn normality, of communities pulling together to care for newly orphaned children and grieving widows, of unexpected acts of kindness and solidarity in a time of overwhelming hardship. One story in particular captures your attention, chilling you to the bone even as it offers a strange glimmer of wonder. In a village much like your own, a woman named Elizabeth lost her husband and all 6 of her children to the plague within a single, horrifying week. Day after day she dragged each of their bodies, one by one, to a hillside behind their home and buried them herself, digging their shallow graves with her own hands. Yet, somehow, despite this intimate, constant contact with the virulent disease, Elizabeth never became ill. Like your brother and the village gravedigger, she appeared to possess some profound natural immunity, that same genetic protection that modern science would one day identify. They say she's a witch, the merchant confides, lowering his voice, though there's no one nearby to overhear. How else could she touch the dead and live? Some wanted to drown her in the pond. but most were just grateful to have someone willing to bury their dead. Such dark rumors are common in these desperate times. Those who survive against such overwhelming odds, particularly if they are women living alone or people with unusual habits or appearances, often find themselves suspected of dark dealings, whispered accusations of sorcery, or pacts with malevolent forces. Fear and superstition, as virulent as the plague itself, flourish in the chaos, sometimes claiming victims of their own. Your father, who has been listening intently to the merchant's tales, shakes his head, his expression firm. "No witchcraft in survival," he says, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "Some are simply stronger against the sickness, like my son." He places a proud, reassuring hand on your brother's shoulder. The merchant nods agreeably, always careful not to contradict a potential customer. "True enough," he concedes. "In every village there are those the plague cannot touch, God's chosen, perhaps." As winter truly arrives, bringing with it bitter cold and early darkness, your village settles into a grim new routine. There are fewer mouths to feed, a small mercy that means the dwindling food stores will last longer than usual. But there are also fewer hands to chop wood, repair crumbling homes, care for livestock, and perform the 100 other daily tasks necessary for bare survival in medieval times. This profound scarcity of labor, felt across the continent, creates subtle but significant shifts in the deeply entrenched relationship between peasants and the nobility. Your father, a skilled carpenter, is suddenly in unprecedented demand. The lord of the manor, who once would have simply commanded his service, now finds himself in the unfamiliar position of negotiating, offering better terms and higher compensation for urgent repairs to the decaying manor house. "He offered me a silver penny for 3 days' work," your father tells your mother one evening, his voice low with amazement and a hint of disbelief. "And a side of bacon." Such wages would have been utterly unthinkable before the plague, a fantastical dream. But with half the skilled craftsmen in the region dead, those who survive find their skills valued as never before, their labor a precious commodity. Similar, transformative changes ripple through all levels of society. Farm laborers, once abundant and easily replaced, now command significantly higher wages for their grueling work. Household servants, especially those with experience running a large home, find themselves eagerly sought after by noble families whose staff have been decimated by disease. Women, too, discover new opportunities in this reshuffled world. Widows, who once would have been pressured to remarry quickly for economic security, now often choose to maintain their independence, taking over and running businesses left by their dead husbands. Guild restrictions, which once rigidly kept women from certain professions, are informally relaxed out of sheer necessity. A woman in a neighboring village, for instance, boldly takes over her late husband's blacksmith forge, scandalizing traditionalists, but providing an essential service no one else can offer. For serfs, peasants legally bound to the land they work, the plague creates unprecedented mobility. Many lords, desperate to keep their fields productive and avoid economic ruin, offer freedom to serfs willing to stay and work for higher wages. Others find they can simply leave, moving to towns where labor is scarce, or to other manors where conditions are more favorable. With so many dead, the enforcement of such restrictive feudal laws becomes increasingly difficult, almost impossible. Not all these changes happen immediately, of course. The feudal system, which has structured European society for centuries, does not collapse overnight. But the indelible seeds of transformation are planted firmly in these early post-plague years, and they will grow profoundly in the decades to come. As for your family, You adjust to this harsh new reality as best you can. Your brother slowly regains his strength, though he tires more easily than before, a lasting mark of his ordeal. Your father finds his carpentry skills in high demand, bringing home better pay and more food than he has ever earned. Your mother takes in washing from the manor house, work that is now better compensated due to the severe shortage of willing hands. You yourself, surprisingly, find opportunities that would never have existed before. The parish priest, one of the few clergy who neither died nor fled during the worst of the plague, needs someone literate to help maintain the church records, an arduous task given the overwhelming number of new burials and the sparse remaining population. With a basic literacy, a rare gift for a peasant child, you are uniquely suited for the task. Your mother, who once served in a noble household and remembered the world of letters, had painstakingly taught you to read and write, a skill she knew could open doors, even in a society where such avenues were typically closed to your kind. Spring arrives, not with a gentle ushering of warmth, but with an unsettling blend of hope and lurking dread. The earth thaws, quickening with new life. You see crops pushing determinedly through the soil in the fields, wildflowers unfurling vibrant carpets across meadows, and hear the joyous cacophony of birds returning from their long winter journeys. Yet this very warmth, this fertile awakening, also ushers in the conditions for the plague to resurface. The air, once sharp and clean, now feels thick with unspoken fear. Sure enough, by early summer, the whispers begin. New cases, the second wave. While less devastating than the initial cataclysm, there are simply fewer people left to infect, and perhaps some survivors carry an innate resistance, a whisper of genetic luck. Each fresh death is a cruel reminder. Each grave reopened, reopening the communal wounds that had barely begun to scab over. One sun-dappled afternoon, as you help the priest meticulously update the parish death register, its parchment pages grimly long with names, a question that has gnawed at your soul finally escapes your lips. Father, why did God send the plague? The priest, an older man whose face is a topographical map of exhaustion and grief, pauses, his quill hovering over the page. He considers your question, his gaze distant, lost in the labyrinth of his own wavering faith, before sighing. Some say it's punishment for sin, he says finally, his voice raspy. Others believe it's a test of faith. The Pope himself has called for prayer and penance to end the scourge. He dips his quill in the inkwell, the faint scratching sound of adding another name to the register echoing in the quiet church. But I've seen the most pious die in agony, he continues, his voice heavy with sorrow, while notorious sinners live unscathed. I've prayed by the bedsides of innocent children as the plague took them. He sighs again, a sound laden with the unbearable weight of incomprehension. Perhaps it's not for us to understand God's plan. This profound crisis of faith, this agonizing inability to reconcile divine justice with unspeakable suffering, echoes through communities across Europe. The plague, with its indiscriminate cruelty, defies the very foundations of medieval religious understanding. If it is divine punishment, why does it strike the virtuous and sinful alike, often sparing the wicked while claiming saints? If fervent prayer and rigorous penance are the cure, why do devoted monasteries, bastions of piety, suffer some of the highest death rates, their cloistered walls becoming tombs? The authority of the Church, once seemingly absolute in matters of earthly misfortune, begins to fray, revealing hairline cracks that, though small now, will widen into chasms in the centuries to come. Medical knowledge faces similar, equally humbling challenges. Physicians, proudly trained in the most prestigious universities, armed with centuries of classical texts, prove no more effective at treating the plague than the humblest village healers. Their elaborate theories, based on the precarious balance of bodily humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and the arcane influences of astronomical alignments, utterly fail to explain the plague's capricious nature, why some recover while others die, why some communities are decimated while others are relatively spared. Some doctors, driven by a profound sense of duty or sheer courage, bravely attend the sick, often sacrificing their own lives in the harrowing process. Others, prioritizing self-preservation over professional oath, flee at the first sign of an outbreak, seeking refuge far from the contaminated cities. Those who stay commonly adopt distinctive, almost theatrical protective clothing, long robes made of heavy fabric, often waxed to repel infection, thick leather gloves, and a mask shaped like a bird's beak, its hollow tip filled with aromatic herbs and pungent spices, rosemary, thyme, juniper, camphor, believed to purify the putrid air, thought to be the source of disease. This strange, iconic outfit, which would become a chilling emblem of later plague outbreaks, does tragically little to protect them from the actual, microscopic source of infection, the Yersinia pestis bacterium carried by fleas. In the harrowing absence of effective official treatment or understanding, communities are forced to develop their own desperate responses to the plague. Some are born of sheer superstition. Villagers cling to strange talismans, recite ancient charms, scrupulously avoid black cats or people with fiery red hair, believing them harbingers of ill fortune. Others, remarkably, exhibit surprising practical value, hinting at an intuitive grasp of contagion. The swift isolation of the sick, the immediate burning of the belongings of plague victims, the rigorous maintenance of cleanliness in homes and streets. None of these measures offer complete protection, of course, but these community-developed practices, born of necessity and fear, sometimes help to limit the relentless spread. Your village, too, adopts several such measures, a testament to its collective will to survive. Houses where the plague has struck are grimly marked with white crosses painted on the doors, stark warnings to those who pass by. Visitors from outside the village, rare as they are now, are made to wait for 3 days in a designated solitary hut before being permitted to enter, a rudimentary quarantine to ensure they show no outward signs of the disease. The dead are buried quickly, with minimal ceremony, often in communal pits rather than individual graves, their possessions burned in smoky pyres to cleanse the air of their lingering presence. These precautions help, offering a thin shield against the unseen enemy, but they cannot stop the plague entirely. By midsummer, your village has lost a dozen more people to this second wave, a serious and painful blow to a community already profoundly diminished by the first outbreak. Among the victims is the lord of the manor himself, a man in his 50s who had, against all odds, survived the initial scourge, only to succumb to this second, seemingly weaker assault. His death creates profound ripples of consequence throughout the local social hierarchy, echoing far beyond the manor gates. His son, barely 20 years old and newly returned from the Grand University in Paris, where he had been exposed to a world of novel ideas and changing philosophies, inherits the manor and its extensive lands. This new lord, young and unburdened by his father's rigid adherence to tradition, takes a remarkably different approach to managing the estate. Recognizing the stark scarcity of labor in the depopulated landscape and sensing the palpable shift in the dynamics of power between lord and peasant, he offers unprecedentedly better terms to his tenant farmers. Serfs who agree to stay and work the manor lands are granted their freedom, a dream once unattainable, and more favorable rents, easing the crushing burden of feudal obligations. Those with specialized skills, like your father, whose carpentry is now invaluable in a world desperate for rebuilding, receive privileges once exclusively reserved for those of much higher social rank. Not all nobles, however, adapt so readily to this brutal new reality. In neighboring manors, some lords, clinging desperately to the vestiges of the old order, attempt to enforce old restrictions with even harsher zeal, forbidding peasants from leaving, punishing those who dare to demand higher wages, and using force to maintain the traditional hierarchy. But these efforts rarely succeed for long. Peasants, now acutely aware of their newfound leverage, simply leave, their feet carrying them towards better conditions elsewhere. With land now abundant and skilled workers frighteningly scarce, they find no shortage of opportunities to rebuild their lives, often in greater freedom and prosperity than they could have ever imagined before the plague. The plague's second wave finally recedes with the crisp, cooling arrival of autumn. Your village has survived, diminished and scarred, but remarkably intact. Of the original 200 residents, perhaps 90 remain, a stark testament to the plague's devastating efficiency. Fields, once parceled among many families, have been consolidated, with the most fertile land prioritized for cultivation, a more efficient use of scarce labor. Houses stand empty, their timbers and thatch gradually scavenged for other uses by those who remain. Yet, life, with its remarkable and indomitable capacity, begins to normalize even after such catastrophe. Children, their laughter once again echoing through the air, play in the village square. The ancient rhythms of agricultural life, planting, tending, harvesting, continue, adapted to the reduced workforce, a poignant symbol of resilience. Weddings take place, new lives are celebrated, babies are born, tiny sparks of hope in the quiet aftermath. Commerce slowly resumes, a fragile thread reconnecting the shattered community to the wider world. One clear, golden autumn day, a surprising visitor arrives in the village, a mason, a man who had left years before to seek work and fortune in the bustling cities. He had built a good life for himself in Florence, he tells anyone who will listen, his voice still carrying the proud echoes of its magnificent beauty, working on the awe-inspiring cathedral there. But when the plague struck, it devastated the city worse than any rural area could comprehend. "I watched half of Florence die," he says, his eyes haunted by indelible memories of unimaginable suffering. The rich fled to their country estates, but the poor had nowhere to go. Bodies piled in the streets faster than they could be buried. I survived, God knows how. After the worst of the plague passed, work on the cathedral, a symbol of human aspiration, halted abruptly. With so many dead, priorities shifted from grand artistry to essential rebuilding, to the stark necessities of survival. The mason, finding himself without steady employment in a city still reeling from death, decided to return to his birthplace, drawn back by the siren call of familiarity and the need for new beginnings. His story is far from unique. Throughout Europe, the plague causes a temporary reversal of the centuries-long trend of urbanization. Cities, with their crowded, unhygienic conditions, are perfect breeding grounds for disease. Many who survive flee the suffocating confines of urban centers for the perceived safety of the countryside, seeking open spaces and the relative isolation of smaller communities. This urban exodus, ironically, brings unexpected benefits to rural villages like yours. People return not only with their lives, but with new skills honed in city workshops, new ideas gleaned from bustling markets and vibrant intellectual centers, and new perspectives gained from their time in a world far removed from the feudal structure of rural areas. The Mason, for instance, animatedly describes how Florence was governed not by a hereditary noble, but by elected officials drawn from the powerful merchant class, a concept almost revolutionary to peasant ears. He speaks of mechanical clocks that precisely divide the day into uniform hours, a radical departure from the imprecise sundials and church bells of village life. He tells of sophisticated water management systems that bring clean water directly into the city, of innovative banking practices that allow trade across vast distances, facilitating complex networks of commerce. These groundbreaking ideas, these whispers of a new world, find fertile ground in communities already questioning traditional authorities and practices, their old certainties shattered by the plague. The Black Death has created profound cracks in the medieval worldview, and through these very cracks, new possibilities, new ways of thinking, living, and governing begin to emerge, casting the first faint glow of a nascent renaissance. For you and your family, life continues in this altered, transformed landscape. Your brother, fully recovered, though forever scarred by his harrowing encounter with the plague, apprentices to the returned Mason, learning a skilled craft that will provide him a secure future in a world where such hands-on expertise is increasingly valued. Your father's carpentry, his hands now more skilled and sought after than ever, keeps the family comfortable, his services now commanding wages that would have been unimaginable before the plague. Your mother, no longer needing to take in washing, instead focuses her considerable talents on an herb garden, cultivating remedies that are in high demand since the plague decimated the ranks of traditional healers. And you, with your invaluable literacy and quick mind, continue assisting the priest with parish records, your unique skills making you exceptionally valuable in a community where such abilities are now a rare and precious commodity. In the old world, your peasant birth would have irrevocably limited your prospects, regardless of your inherent abilities. In the post-plague world, with its fluid social boundaries and desperate, urgent need for talent wherever it can be found, opportunities, once unthinkable, now expand before you like a burgeoning landscape. One evening, as your family sits cozily around the hearth, sharing a meal more abundant and varied than any you might have hoped for in the leaner, pre-plague years, your father, after a long silence, voices a thought that many are undoubtedly contemplating in their hearts. "It's a terrible thing to say," he begins hesitantly, his voice tinged with both guilt and gratitude. "But for those of us who survived, life is better now than before." Your mother nods slowly, her gaze thoughtful. "More food, better pay, more freedom," she agrees, then adds softly, her eyes darkening slightly, "built on countless graves." It is the uncomfortable, heartbreaking paradox at the very heart of the post-plague world. For those fortunate enough to survive, whether through sheer genetic luck like your brother, a fluke of circumstantial fortune, or the simple isolation from infection sources, the new world offers tangible advantages that the old one never could. The massive and catastrophic reduction in population creates unprecedented opportunities for social advancement, economic improvement, and personal freedom that would have been utterly unthinkable in the crowded, rigidly hierarchical, and largely static pre-plague society. Yet these benefits come at an unimaginable, horrific cost. The lives of millions, the brutal destruction of families, communities torn apart, knowledge and culture lost forever with those who carried it. No survivor can fully, truly enjoy their improved circumstances without the dark, lingering shadow of this terrible knowledge. As you drift toward sleep that night, the embers in the hearth casting dancing shadows on the walls, you find yourself wondering about the future. The plague has retreated for now, its immediate fury spent, but no one believes it is gone forever. It will return, as it has before, bringing new waves of death, new cycles of terror. Yet, humanity, you sense, will somehow survive, adapting to each new outbreak, developing new responses, gradually, painstakingly, building knowledge that will, centuries later, finally conquer this invisible, insidious enemy. What you cannot know in your quiet village home is that you stand at a profound turning point in history. The world that will emerge from the ashes of the Black Death will be fundamentally, irrevocably different from what came before. The seeds of the Renaissance, of a new era of humanism and inquiry, are being planted in these very years of recovery. The rigid feudal system, once thought immutable, is beginning its long, slow decline. The unquestioned authority of traditional power structures, both secular and religious, has been profoundly shaken, paving the way for new political and social philosophies. And on a biological level, the plague has reshaped the human species itself, selecting for genetic traits that will influence health and disease resistance for generations to come. Your brother's survival, far from being merely personal good fortune, represents a vital evolutionary chapter in humanity's endless, intricate dance with the microscopic organisms that both sustain and threaten us. Tomorrow, as a new day dawns on your changed world, you will continue the work of rebuilding, of adapting, of finding a way forward. That is what plague survivors have always done throughout history. They carry on, bearing the immense weight of memory and loss, while resolutely facing toward the future. And in doing so, they reshape the world in ways that will echo through centuries to come. The story of survival we've been following through the Black Death of the 14th century is far from the only tale of courage, resilience, and genetic luck in humanity's long, arduous dance with plague. As the soft darkness of sleep envelops you, let's journey forward through time to another village, another devastating outbreak, and another remarkable story of sacrifice and survival. 300 years have passed since the first devastating waves of the Black Death swept through Europe, leaving an indelible scar on the continent. It is now the warm summer of 1665, and we find ourselves in Eyam, a small, unassuming village nestled deep in the picturesque, verdant hills of Derbyshire, England. Eyam, you know, is pronounced just like Em. It is a peaceful community of about 800 souls, mostly sturdy farmers tilling the fertile valleys and hardy lead miners extracting their living from the rich veins running beneath the ancient limestone landscape. Life here follows the familiar, comforting rhythms of rural England. The villagers rise with the sun, tending their fields and animals with generations of inherited wisdom, working in the small local industries, attending services at the venerable parish church of St. Lawrence, and gathering at the local tavern to share news and the warmth of companionship. It is a close-knit community where everyone knows everyone else, where families have lived for generations, their histories intertwined, where the bonds of neighborly care and mutual support have been forged through shared joys and countless hardships. What the people of Eyam don't know, however, is that they are about to face the greatest test imaginable, one that will indelibly etch their village name into history and enshrine their collective sacrifice in legend. The plague has returned to England. In London, the bustling, overcrowded capital, the disease that people still call the Black Death though we now scientifically know it as bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, is cutting a deadly, merciless swath through the crowded streets and narrow alleys. By the time its fury is spent, it will claim an estimated 100,000 Londoners, nearly a quarter of the city's entire population. This specific outbreak will forever be known as the Great Plague of London, the last major epidemic of bubonic plague to ravage England. For now, the villagers of Eyam feel secure in their quiet isolation. The plague, they tell themselves, is a city problem, a distant terror unlikely to reach their remote community, nestled deep in the Derbyshire hills, far from major trade routes and bustling urban centers. But fate, as it often does, has other, more tragic plans. In late August 1665, a package arrives in Eyam, addressed to the local tailor Alexander Hadfield. It contains a bundle of fine cloth from London, perhaps exotic designs for the latest fashions, or luxurious fabrics not available locally. Hadfield's young assistant, George Vickers, who lodges with the tailor and his family, unpacks the parcel. The cloth, having endured a long journey in a damp sea chest or wagon, feels moist. So Vickers, in an innocent act that would seal the village's doom, hangs it by the warm hearth fire to dry, unwittingly releasing the deadly cargo hidden within its unsuspecting folds. Fleas, agitated by the journey, now carrying the virulent plague bacterium Yersinia pestis. Within days, George Vickers falls gravely ill, racked by a raging fever that consumes him. Then appear the telltale buboes, swollen, agonizingly painful lymph nodes, emerging first in his neck, then in his armpits and groin. The village watches in horror and growing dread as this strong, vibrant young man rapidly deteriorates, his life draining away with terrifying speed. By September 7, 1665, George Vickers is dead. He is the first plague victim in Eyam. Panic, cold and visceral, ripples through the tight-knit community as more people sicken, each new cough, each sudden fever stirring fresh terror. By the end of September, 4 more residents of Eyam have died, all from households agonizingly close to Vickers's lodgings. The plague has gained its first, terrifying foothold. As autumn progresses, the situation worsens exponentially. More villagers fall ill, their bodies marked by the hideous buboes, and the death rate climbs relentlessly. Some families lose multiple members within days of each other, their homes becoming silent tombs. The gravediggers, few in number and overwhelmed by the mounting fatalities, can barely keep pace, working day and night to bury the dead. The natural, almost instinctive reaction in such desperate circumstances is flight. In London, anyone who could afford to, including King Charles II and his entire court, had fled the plague-ridden city for the perceived safety of country retreats. The wealthier residents of Eyam, too, begin making anxious preparations to leave, to seek refuge in uninfected areas until the danger passes, to save themselves and their families. It is at this critical, terrifying moment that 2 remarkable men step forward with an extraordinary proposition, one that will save countless lives beyond Eyam, but in doing so will condemn many within the village to almost certain death. William Mompesson, the recently appointed rector of Eyam, a man of profound faith and quiet courage, and his predecessor, Thomas Stanley, a respected Puritan minister who, despite his doctrinal differences with Mompesson, recognized the dire threat, put aside their religious disagreements. Mompesson, representing the established Church of England, and Stanley, adhering to the Puritan tradition, stand united to present a unified, desperate plan to the village. They propose that Eyam voluntarily quarantine itself. No one will leave the village boundaries. No one will enter. The plague, they reason, must be contained within their confines, preventing its inexorable spread to neighboring communities that would otherwise be at grave and immediate risk. It is a staggering, almost unfathomable request. In essence, the villagers are being asked to sacrifice themselves, to accept that many more of them will die a horrifying death, all to protect strangers in surrounding areas. Remarkably, after intense deliberation, discussion, and agonizing soul-searching, they agree. The village boundary becomes a sacred cordon sanitaire, a stark, uncompromising line between life and death that no resident of Eyam will cross. Food and essential supplies are left at designated boundary stones by sympathetic outsiders, particularly by the benevolent Earl of Devonshire from nearby Chatsworth House, who promises to provide for the isolated villagers throughout their ordeal. Money to pay for these crucial provisions is placed in vinegar-filled holes in the rocks, as it is widely believed that vinegar will disinfect the coins, preventing the transmission of the deadly contagion. What follows is one of the most poignant, heroic, and agonizing episodes in the long, often brutal history of humanity's battle with infectious disease. Summer turns to autumn, autumn to a bitter winter, and winter to a hopeful spring. Through it all, the plague continues its deadly, relentless work within the confined, sacred boundaries of Eyam. Entire families are tragically wiped out, their homes falling silent, their names vanishing from the village rolls. Children are orphaned, only to die themselves days later, their cries echoing in empty houses. Houses stand empty, their occupants buried hastily in gardens and fields, since the churchyard quickly becomes terribly full, its consecrated ground unable to hold any more of the dead. Within this tragedy, individual stories emerge that illuminate the extraordinary nature of human courage, suffering, and the tenacious will to survive. Elizabeth Hancock, a farmer's wife living at Riley Farm on the very edge of the village, endures a loss almost beyond human comprehension. In the space of just 8 agonizing days in August 1666, at the height of the outbreak, the plague claims her husband and 6 of her beloved children. With no one to help her, for neighbors, paralyzed by fear, dare not approach the infected household, Elizabeth single-handedly drags each lifeless body to a field near their home and buries them herself. An act of unimaginable fortitude, born of both love and desperation. The remarkable, almost miraculous aspect of Elizabeth's story is not just her incredible strength in the face of such devastating personal loss, but the astounding fact that despite handling the plague-riddled bodies of her entire family, she never contracts the disease herself. Like the survivors we met in our earlier tale, Elizabeth likely carries the CCR5 delta 32 genetic mutation, a tiny, invaluable alteration in her DNA that offers significant protection against the plague bacterium. The Riley graves, as they come to be known, stand to this day as a silent, poignant testament to one woman's suffering, endurance, and inexplicable survival. Another extraordinary, though ethically complex tale is that of Marshall Howe, Eyam's unofficial gravedigger. As the death toll mounts relentlessly, Howe, a pragmatic and perhaps morally ambiguous man, takes on the grim, arduous task of burial, not out of noble sacrifice, but for more mercenary reasons. He sees an opportunity to loot the homes of the dead before meticulously disposing of their bodies. Despite this unsavory behavior, Howe's story contains an element of profound medical mystery. He handles dozens, perhaps hundreds of infected corpses, their buboes bursting with deadly bacteria. He enters plague-ridden houses that others avoid at all costs. By all logical reasoning, he should be among the very first to die, a swift victim of the contagion he handles daily. Yet, Marshal Howe survives the entire outbreak, working tirelessly without ever showing symptoms of the disease. Modern science, once again, suggests a likely explanation: the same protective genetic mutation that prevents the plague bacterium from gaining entry to his cells. What Howe likely attributes to sheer luck or divine protection is in reality the result of a tiny, fortunate alteration in his DNA, one that gives him an unparalleled edge in humanity's ongoing evolutionary battle against the microscopic enemy. Then there's the heartbreaking story of Emmett Seidel and Roland Torre, young lovers cruelly separated by the village quarantine. Emmett lives within Eam, her fate sealed by the cordon, while Roland is from a neighboring village, forever outside the boundary. As the quarantine takes effect, they find themselves suddenly and indefinitely separated, their future uncertain. Unwilling to completely lose contact, to let fear extinguish their tender devotion, they arrange to meet at a safe distance across Cuckoldit Dell, a natural ravine that marks part of the village boundary. There, standing far apart, their voices carrying across the gully, avoiding any risk of transmitting infection, they can at least see each other and exchange words of comfort, devotion, and fading hope. These brief, distant meetings sustain them through the early, terrifying months of the quarantine. But as spring turns to summer in 1666, and the plague reaches its agonizing peak intensity in Eam, Emmett stops coming to their meeting place. Roland, heartbroken but hopeful, continues to appear day after day, calling her name across the chasm, receiving no answer but the mocking echo of his own voice. Only after the quarantine finally ends, after months of agonizing uncertainty, does Roland learn the devastating truth. Emmett died in April, one of many young victims tragically claimed by the plague. Their love story, cut short by disease but forever marked by faithful devotion, remains one of Eam's most enduring and poignant legends. Perhaps strangest of all is the tale of Margaret Blackwell, who fell gravely ill with all the terrifying symptoms of the plague, and was, in her fevered state, left for dead by her despairing brother, Francis, who expected her to succumb at any moment. In her delirium, racked by an unbearable thirst, Margaret staggered to the kitchen, desperately seeking relief. In her confused state, mistaking a container of rendered bacon fat for milk, she drank deeply of the greasy liquid. To everyone's astonishment, Margaret, against all odds, recovered. For centuries, villagers would tell the incredible story of how bacon fat miraculously cured the plague, a testament to the desperate search for any remedy. The truth, of course, is likely more complex. Margaret probably carried the genetic resistance we've discussed and would have recovered regardless of her unusual beverage choice. But the legend persisted, a powerful reminder of how desperately people searched for any treatment, any miracle that might save them from the plague's deadly, unyielding grip. Through it all, the village's religious leaders provide what comfort and spiritual solace they can. William Mompesson, who proposed the quarantine alongside Thomas Stanley, pays a terrible, agonizing personal price for his courageous and selfless stand. His beloved wife, Catherine, contracts the plague while selflessly helping to care for sick villagers, and dies in her husband's arms in August 1666, at the very height of the outbreak's brutal fury. Mompesson, though he survives physically, describes himself afterward as a dying man, his spirit forever broken by the loss and the overwhelming suffering he witnessed. In a heart-wrenching letter to his children, who had been sent away to safety before the quarantine was enacted, he writes, "The condition of this place is very sad. I entreat you to fly this place. I am not in a condition to receive comfort from you. I am so weak I can write no more." Yet despite his profound grief and personal desolation, he continues to minister to his suffering congregation until the very end, a shepherd tending his dying flock. Church services, in a remarkable adaptation to the threat, move outdoors to Cucklelet Dell, where the fresh air is believed to reduce the risk of contagion. Villagers stand far apart from one another as they pray, a solemn and early form of what we now call social distancing, their shared faith a fragile shield against fear. Even in the darkest hours, when death seems to lurk in every shadow, the community maintains its spiritual practices, finding solace and a semblance of order in familiar rituals, even as the world collapses around them. Not everyone behaves nobly, of course. There are instances of desperate looting, of neighbors, paralyzed by fear, refusing to help one another, of panic overriding compassion and shared humanity. One villager, Mary Cooper, attempts to break the quarantine, fleeing desperately toward the safety of Sheffield before being caught and, by tragic necessity, returned to Eyam. But these lapses are, in the grand narrative, exceptions. The overwhelming, enduring story of Eyam is one of extraordinary collective sacrifice for the greater good, a testament to humanity's capacity for selflessness. By the time the plague finally runs its devastating course in November 1666, it has raged through Eyam for 14 brutal months. Of the approximately 800 villagers present when the outbreak began, only about 340 remain alive. Entire family lines are extinguished, their names now just memories. The village's social fabric is torn apart, riddled with gaps that will take generations to mend, if ever. Yet their harrowing sacrifice achieves its profound, selfless purpose. The plague remains contained within Eyam's boundaries. Surrounding communities, which would almost certainly have been infected had the villagers fled, are spared the devastation. Thousands of lives are saved by the deliberate, agonizing choice of a few hundred to face death rather than spread it to others. In the quiet, somber aftermath, as the survivors begin the long, arduous process of rebuilding their shattered community, they cannot know the immense legacy they have created. They cannot imagine that 3.5 centuries later, their story will still be told, passed down through generations, as a luminous example of extraordinary communal courage, self-sacrifice, and an enduring human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. They could not have known, sealed off in their dying hamlet, that the terrifying scourge which ravaged their homes was destined to be the final great outbreak of bubonic plague ever to darken England's shores. Nor could they have foreseen the subtle, intricate reasons why. Perhaps a particular evolutionary weakness in the Yersinia pestis strain of the 1660s that rendered it less virulent in subsequent years, or the slow, inexorable march of progress in sanitation and housing that would gradually diminish the sprawling rat populations, the disease's unwitting vectors, reducing their numbers and thus the plague's reach. They certainly couldn't have comprehended that, centuries hence, brilliant scientists of the future would pore over their descendants' genetic code, unearthing an unexpectedly high prevalence of the CCR5 Delta 32 mutation among those whose family trees rooted deeply in Eyam's survivor stock. This discovery would emerge as powerful, undeniable evidence, etched into human DNA, of how the relentless pressure of infectious disease fundamentally reshapes human evolution through the crucible of natural selection. And with even greater certainty, they could not have imagined that their profound act of communal sacrifice would resonate with such piercing poignancy in the early 21st century, when a terrifying global pandemic would once again seize the world, forcing entire communities across continents to grapple with agonizing choices about self-imposed isolation, stringent quarantine measures, and the bitter necessity of collective sacrifice for the greater good of all. All they knew in that desolate moment was the stark, visceral reality. They had survived an ordeal that stretched the very limits of human comprehension. They had watched, helpless, as neighbors, dear friends, and beloved family members succumbed by the dozens, their lives extinguished with chilling rapidity. They had stoically endured their self-imposed isolation through the suffocating heat of summer and the biting cold of winter, through the corrosive grip of fear, the crushing weight of grief, and a magnitude of loss that defied articulation. Now, as the plague's insidious grip finally began to loosen its hold on their decimated village, they faced the equally daunting task of simply finding a way to continue living. The survivors of were confronted with a brutal landscape of immediate practical challenges. The once thriving fields, their lifeblood, lay barren and untended, choked by weeds. Businesses, once bustling, had collapsed into silence. Homes, once warm and vibrant, now stood in disrepair, their roofs sagging, their walls crumbling. With so many dead, the traditional fabric of family structures had been utterly shredded. Orphaned children, bewildered and bereft, desperately needed new homes. Widows and widowers, grappling with an unimaginable void, had to make agonizing decisions about whether to seek new companionship or face a solitary future. Property ownership, once a clear line of inheritance, became a tangled, heartbreaking mess when entire family lines had been abruptly extinguished. Yet, true to the enduring spirit of humanity, the remarkable capacity for resilience, a theme woven throughout all our plague narratives, asserted itself once more. From the shattered fragments of families destroyed by disease, new, composite households began to form, bound by shared trauma and mutual need. Distant relatives, who had perhaps never before considered their home, slowly trickled back, drawn by the prospect of abandoned property and the shared responsibility of breathing fresh life into the depleted village. Those individuals who possessed useful skills, a carpenter, a blacksmith, a weaver, found themselves suddenly in unprecedented demand, able to command not just respect, but significantly better compensation than they had ever dreamed of before the pestilence. In its terrifying, indiscriminate sweep, the plague had acted as a terrible but brutally effective form of natural selection. Those who survived, whether through a fortunate genetic resistance, sheer circumstantial luck, or some unknowable combination of factors, became, by necessity, the fertile ground for the village's eventual rebirth. Their descendants, unknowingly, would carry forward a potent genetic legacy of plague resistance, a silent inheritance that they would not even begin to comprehend for centuries to come. But for some, the psychological scars, deeper than any physical wound, would never truly heal. Elizabeth Hancock, for instance, who had, with her own hands, painstakingly buried her entire family, her husband and 6 children, in a field near their cottage, eventually remarried and even bore more children. Yet villagers often spoke of her, their voices hushed, saying she was never quite the same. A distant, haunted look would sometimes drift into her eyes, as if she were peering into a realm unseen by others, forever reliving the spectral shadows of that terrible week when death had ruthlessly claimed every soul she loved. Marshall Howe, the unscrupulous gravedigger whose survival against such overwhelming odds was itself a grim miracle, found himself somewhat ostracized. Despite his apparent immunity, the villagers vividly remembered his cold-hearted looting of the dead, his greed amidst their deepest grief. While his morbid services had been undeniably necessary during the height of the crisis, the return of peace brought with it a quiet yet relentless reckoning with his behavior. He remained in but always on the periphery, a stark reminder of humanity's darker side. William Merson, a man utterly broken by grief at the devastating loss of his beloved wife, Catherine, chose a different path. He could no longer bear to remain in the village now a mausoleum of memories. In 1669, he left, seeking solace and a new beginning by taking up a position elsewhere. He eventually remarried and lived to the respectable age of 71, but his private letters, discovered centuries later, offered a poignant glimpse into his soul, revealing that he never truly forgot the unrelenting horror of those plague months, nor the profound, selfless sacrifice of his Catherine. Her image, a beacon in his memory, forever defined his understanding of enduring love and immense loss. As for the village itself, embarked on a long, arduous journey of recovery. Slowly, painstakingly, it regained its population, though the records would forever bear witness to the disappearance of some cherished family names. The story of the quarantine, once a brutal necessity, became woven into the fabric of local law and lore, a tale passed down through generations, a narrative imbued with a complex blend of profound pride for their ancestors' courage and an enduring sorrow for their immense sacrifice. By the 19th century, as Victorian England developed a fervent interest in noteworthy historical episodes, Am's extraordinary story was rediscovered, chronicled, and popularized. The Plague Village, as it became known, began to draw curious visitors, pilgrims of history eager to connect with its tragic past. The stark Riley graves, the weathered boundary stones, and other poignant physical remnants of the quarantine were transformed into informal yet deeply respected monuments to a singular act of courage. By the dawn of the 21st century, had firmly established itself as a mandatory stop on heritage tourism routes winding through Derbyshire. The quaint village museum, meticulously curated and passionately told the story of the plague and the quarantine, while the ancient parish church proudly displayed artifacts and heartfelt commemorations. Since 1866, a solemn Plague Sunday service has been held annually, a steadfast tradition, marking the community's enduring sacrifice and remembrance. But is far more than a mere historical curiosity, frozen in time. It remains a vibrant, living community, a place where the direct descendants of those plague survivors still make their homes. Some carry the very same surnames as those who valiantly lived through the devastating 1665 to 1666 outbreak. The Hancocks, the Siddles, the Blackwells. And, astonishingly, modern genetic testing has revealed that some of them still carry that precious CCR5 delta 32 mutation, the genetic shield that may very well have saved their ancestors from the ravages of the plague, a silent echo of history in their very blood. The enduring story of reminds us, with profound clarity, that history is not merely a dry collection of dates and events to be memorized or recited. It is the raw, lived experience of real people, complex individuals facing truly extraordinary circumstances. It is their agonizing choices, their selfless sacrifices, and their very survival that, imperceptibly, yet powerfully, shape the complex world we inhabit today. As the soft darkness of sleep begins to envelop you more deeply, carry with you the tranquil image of village as it stands today. Peaceful, picturesque, its charming stone cottages and vibrant flower gardens offering little overt hint of the profound tragedy that once unfolded within its boundaries. Yet, in the quiet dignity of the memorial plaques, in the steadfast presence of the preserved boundary stones that once marked the line of death, and in the carefully tended Riley graves nestled on the hillside, the past remains undeniably present, a constant, gentle whisper. The villagers who made the unthinkable choice to isolate themselves, fully aware that many among them would die as a direct consequence of their decision, could not possibly have imagined how long their harrowing story would endure, or how profoundly meaningful it would remain to countless future generations. They acted not for the abstract glory of a historical legacy, but out of an immediate, urgent concern for the lives of their closest neighbors and the health of the surrounding communities. And perhaps it is precisely this pure, unadulterated motivation, this absolute absence of expectation for recognition or reward, that imbues their sacrifice with such immense, timeless power. It was simply the right thing to do in a moment of unimaginable crisis. In a world that often seems to relentlessly prioritize individual benefit over the collective welfare, stands as an enduring, luminous reminder that human beings are fundamentally capable of truly extraordinary selflessness when circumstances demand nothing less. Tomorrow night, our journey will continue as we explore how the entire world irrevocably changed in the profound aftermath of these sweeping plague outbreaks, how societies painstakingly rebuilt themselves from the ashes, how entrenched power structures shifted and realigned, and how the insidious, yet ultimately hopeful, biological legacy of plague resistance continues to subtly influence human health, even in our advanced modern age. But for now, let the quiet, unwavering courage of villagers accompany you into your dreams, a silent, yet powerful, testament to humanity's boundless capacity for sacrifice, for survival, and, ultimately, for enduring hope. Let's now journey back, far back in time, to the chilling aftermath of the 14th century Black Death. While poignant story from the 1660s vividly illuminates the courage of a single, isolated village, the truly colossal pandemic of the 1300s utterly transformed entire societies, shaking the very foundations of the medieval world. As we drift deeper into this historical dreamscape, let us explore, with renewed wonder, how surviving such an unimaginable catastrophe reshaped every aspect of life in medieval Europe. Imagine yourself once more in that small, familiar village we visited earlier in our journey. But now, the year is 1352. The initial, devastating waves of the plague have finally subsided, leaving behind a profoundly transformed landscape, both physically scarred and socially reordered. As your gaze sweeps across the village, which had once been home to a bustling community of perhaps 200 souls, you can now count a mere 90 people remaining, ghostly figures moving through a desolate scene. Empty cottages, their windows like hollow-eyed skulls, stand eerily along the winding lane. Their once sturdy thatched roofs, now neglected and unmaintained, have begun to collapse inward, exposing their skeletal timbers to the elements. Their small gardens, once carefully tended and vibrant with life, are now grotesquely overgrown with tangled weeds and wild grasses. Yet, amidst this profound desolation, almost imperceptible at first, subtle signs of profound change are slowly beginning to appear. Minute alterations that, over generations, will fundamentally alter the very foundations of medieval society, setting in motion a cascade of transformations. In the fields surrounding the village, the shift is immediately visible, stark and undeniable. Before the plague, every available piece of land, no matter how meager or infertile, had been painstakingly cultivated, even marginal soils that stubbornly yielded only poor, grudging harvests. Generations of relentless population growth had inexorably pushed farming onto less and less productive terrain, as families desperately struggled to coax enough sustenance from the earth to feed their ever-expanding numbers. Now, with so many gone, land is suddenly, startlingly abundant. The surviving villagers, freed from the crushing necessity of maximizing every acre, wisely abandoned the least fertile fields entirely, focusing their precious labor and limited resources on the richest, most productive soils. This seemingly simple shift dramatically improves crop yields per person. Where once a peasant family might have toiled endlessly, often struggling just to produce enough to feed themselves after paying their burdensome taxes and tithes to the Lord and the Church, they now frequently harvest a surprising surplus. For those who had somehow survived the apocalyptic mortality, food is more plentiful and accessible than it has been in living memory. After centuries of existing precariously on the very edge of hunger, this newfound abundance feels nothing short of miraculous, a small, tangible compensation for the soul-crushing emotional devastation of losing so many family members and cherished neighbors. Predictably, dramatic changes in diet soon follow. Before the plague, the vast majority of peasants subsisted primarily on a monotonous diet of grain-based staples. Bread, thick porridge, and weak ale formed the unvarying bulk of their daily nutrition, with meat appearing only as a rare, almost mythical luxury, often reserved for feast days or for the Lord's table. Now, with significantly fewer mouths to feed and vast tracts of land suddenly available, many cunningly convert fields previously used for cereal crops into lush pastures for raising livestock. Consequently, meat, as well as rich cheese and creamy butter, begin to appear more frequently on humble peasant tables, once bare. The average height of the population, which had been in a concerning decline for generations due to chronic malnutrition and hardship, begins to noticeably increase again as diets measurably improve, reflecting a fundamental improvement in public health and well-being. But the most profound and far-reaching changes come not from shifts in diet or land use, but in the fundamental relationship between workers and landowners, a dynamic that had defined medieval society for centuries. The massive, unprecedented population loss, roughly half of Europe's entire populace vanished in a few terrifying years, creates an acute, crippling labor shortage. Fields still desperately need plowing and sowing, crops need harvesting, wool needs weaving into cloth, and buildings, always in need of repair, demand attention. Yet there are simply not enough hands left to do all the necessary work. For the surviving peasants and artisans, this brutal new reality brings with it an unprecedented, almost unimaginable degree of leverage and bargaining power. Consider the case of Thomas Fletcher, a diligent plowman in your particular village. Before the plague, his life was one of unremitting toil. He worked the manor lord's fields 6 days a week, often from dawn till dusk, in exchange for a tiny, often marginal plot of land to farm for himself and his family. If he ever dared to complain, or if he failed for even a single day to provide the required labor service, dozens of other hungry, desperate peasants stood ready, eager to take his place, their eyes gleaming with quiet desperation. He was expendable, replaceable. Now, however, with half the village's workforce dead, vanished into the plague pits, the local manor steward, a man usually accustomed to absolute deference, approaches Thomas with an extraordinary, almost revolutionary offer: a significantly larger plot of land, a dramatic reduction in his labor service from 6 days a week to just 3, and, astonishingly, the freedom to work for wages on other manors if he so wished, a concept that would have been unthinkable just a few years prior. The steward makes this offer not out of any sudden surge of generosity, but out of stark, desperate necessity. Without Thomas's skilled plowing, the vital fields will lie fallow, unworked, and everyone, including the powerful lord of the manor himself, will ultimately suffer. Similar revolutionary scenes play out across Europe. Peasants who for generations had been immutably bound to the land as serfs, their lives dictated by the whims of their lords, suddenly find themselves with options, a freedom previously unheard of. Many desperate landlords facing economic ruin grudgingly offer complete freedom from serfdom as a powerful incentive to keep their remaining workers on their estates. Others convert traditional labor obligations to simple rent payments, allowing peasants to farm the land as they see fit, cultivating what they choose as long as they pay the agreed amount in coin or kind. For skilled workers, the masons, carpenters, blacksmiths, and weavers, the changes are even more dramatic and transformative. All find their specialized services in desperate, urgent demand. Wages for such workers double, triple, or even quadruple in the years immediately following the plague, skyrocketing to unprecedented levels. A skilled carpenter who could once barely feed his family now builds for himself a solid 2-room house, complete with precious glass windows, wears better quality clothing, and eats meat 3 times a week. Luxuries that would have been the envy of a minor gentry family just a generation before. These radical changes, however, profoundly alarm the entrenched nobility and the wealthy merchant classes. They watch with mounting fear as the traditional, rigid social order, which had seemed as eternal as the stars, visibly crumbles before their eyes. Former serfs, once meek and subservient, now demand better treatment, their voices emboldened by their newfound leverage. Common laborers, once barely scraping by, now live lives that rival those of minor gentry, their pockets jingling with unprecedented coin. Across Europe, desperate authorities attempt to reverse this tide, issuing decrees to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and to forcibly compel workers back into their previous conditions of servitude. In England, the government swiftly issues the punitive Ordinance of Laborers in 1349, followed by the even more comprehensive Statute of Laborers in 1351. These draconian laws explicitly prohibit employers from offering higher wages than had been paid before the plague's arrival, forbid workers from leaving their home villages to seek better opportunities elsewhere, and even attempt to fix prices for essential food and other goods. Similar, equally ineffective, legislation appears across the continent. France enacts its own wage controls in 1351, as does the powerful city-state of Florence. The Spanish Kingdom of Castile desperately tries to prevent peasant mobility with its own restrictive labor laws. But these authoritarian efforts, however well-intentioned by the ruling class, largely fail. The labor shortage is simply too severe, too widespread, too deeply ingrained in the new economic reality. The relentless economic pressures are too great to be contained by mere decrees. Enforcement proves nearly impossible, especially in sprawling rural areas where local officials, themselves often dependent on maintaining good relations with the remaining, increasingly powerful workers, frequently turn a blind eye to violations. Workers, driven by self-interest and a new sense of their own value, quickly develop creative, ingenious ways to circumvent the imposed wage controls. A carpenter, for example, prohibited by law from accepting more than a certain daily wage, might receive generous gifts of food, fine clothing, or even housing in addition to his official, legally mandated pay. A farm laborer, emboldened by the knowledge of his indispensability, might work slowly or carelessly, unless quietly offered better terms than the law officially allowed, a subtle form of resistance. For those tasked with enforcing these futile laws, the mathematics of the situation is brutally unforgiving. Before the plague, a lord might have had 100 peasants diligently working his land. Now he has 50, or often fewer. Punishing one recalcitrant worker by imprisonment or fines only exacerbates his already critical labor shortage. And if he treats his remaining workers too harshly, too unfairly, they might simply leave, regardless of the legal prohibitions against such mobility, confident in the knowledge that they will find welcome, well-paid employment elsewhere, where their skills are valued. The escalating situation inevitably comes to a head in a series of violent peasant revolts across Europe. In 1358, the rural areas surrounding Paris erupt in the fierce Jacquerie Rebellion, as desperate, enraged peasants attack and burn castles and noble estates. Though brutally suppressed with overwhelming force, the rebellion starkly demonstrates the new, burgeoning confidence and the deep-seated grievances of the laboring classes. In England, similar tensions simmer for decades, building beneath the surface until 1381, when they finally explode in the epic Peasants' Revolt, led by charismatic figures like Wat Tyler, Jack Straw, and a radical priest named John Ball. Tens of thousands of commoners, a furious tide of humanity, march on London, demanding nothing less than an end to serfdom, the abolition of the hated poll tax, and a fundamental shift towards greater social equality. John Ball's famous incendiary sermon encapsulates the revolutionary spirit of the moment. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? He asks rhetorically, his voice thundering, directly questioning the very idea of aristocratic privilege and divine right. From the beginning, all men were created alike, and our bondage or servitude came in by the unjust oppression of naughty men. Though the English revolt, much like the Jacquerie, is eventually suppressed through a cynical combination of false promises and brutal military force, it represents a profound, irreversible shift in consciousness. Peasants who had once passively accepted their subordinate position as divinely ordained now openly question the entire social hierarchy. Workers who formerly had little choice but to accept whatever meager terms were offered now demand better treatment, asserting it as their undeniable due. The economic and social transformations following the plague are by no means limited to the rural areas. Towns and cities experience their own profound, wrenching changes. Urban centers, with their crowded, often unsanitary conditions, had suffered particularly high mortality rates during the pandemic. Florence, for example, one of medieval Europe's largest and most vibrant cities, lost as much as 75% of its entire population, a staggering, catastrophic loss. This devastating demographic vacuum, however, paradoxically creates unprecedented opportunities for the survivors. Housing, previously scarce and prohibitively expensive in successful, burgeoning cities, suddenly becomes abundant and remarkably affordable. Apprentices, once facing a decade or more of subservience, find themselves elevated to master status years earlier than normal, as guilds, decimated by the plague, lose many of their most senior and experienced members. Women, traditionally excluded from many skilled occupations, boldly enter trades left vacant by their dead male relatives, seizing opportunities previously unimaginable. Consider the compelling story of Margareta, a weaver's widow in a bustling small market town. Before the plague, she was permitted only to assist her husband in his workshop, a silent, unpaid helper. But she was expressly forbidden from operating as an independent artisan. Guild regulations, strict and unyielding, explicitly forbade women from owning and operating a weaving business in their own right. When her husband tragically dies of the plague, leaving Margareta not only with his tools and his loom, but also with the extensive expertise she had gained working faithfully alongside him for years, the depleted Weavers' Guild faces a critical choice. Should they rigidly enforce the prohibition against female members and risk losing a skilled, vital practitioner, further weakening their already diminished ranks? Or should they adapt to this brutal new reality? Faced with drastically falling membership, dwindling output, and an ever-rising demand for cloth, the Guild, after much deliberation, reluctantly admits Margareta as a full member. A pragmatic, revolutionary compromise, one of dozens of similar concessions made across Europe, as stark necessity trumped generations of entrenched tradition. Though such expanded economic opportunities for women would eventually contract as populations gradually recovered, for several generations after the plague, women enjoyed expanded economic roles that would have been utterly unimaginable before the pandemic. The plague's devastating aftermath also witnesses striking changes in fashion, art, and architecture, reflecting a profound shift in collective consciousness. The immense, indiscriminate mortality creates a stark new awareness of death's inevitability and life's profound fragility. The macabre emerges as a dominant artistic theme, permeating every aspect of visual culture. Skeletal figures, gruesome death's heads, and chilling scenes of the dance of death, where animated skeletons gleefully lead people from all social classes, from kings to commoners, to their inexorable graves, become ubiquitous. Yet, paradoxically, alongside this morbid fascination with mortality comes a vibrant, almost defiant celebration of life and its transient pleasures. Survivors, perhaps acutely conscious of how quickly existence can end, embrace luxury, beauty, and earthly delights with a renewed, almost desperate appreciation. Among those who can afford it, clothing becomes notably more elaborate, colorful, and extravagant. The drab, practical garments of earlier medieval periods give way to rich, imported fabrics, bold, ostentatious designs, and new styles that loudly signify social status. The nobility, deeply alarmed by commoners dressing above their station, frantically attempt to enforce sumptuary laws, dictating precisely what each social class may and may not wear. These edicts, much like the feudal wage controls, prove largely unenforceable. A prosperous artisan's wife might technically be prohibited from wearing imported silk. But if she can afford it, who in her small community truly possesses both the authority and the motivation to stop her from displaying her newfound wealth? Religious attitudes, too, undergo their own profound transformation. The Church, which had for centuries dominated medieval intellectual and spiritual life, suddenly faces a deep crisis of authority and credibility. Many priests and monks, gripped by fear, abandoned their posts during the plague, shamefully deserting their frightened flocks when spiritual comfort and guidance were most desperately needed. Others, more courageous or perhaps simply less fortunate, stayed and died, leaving countless parishes without leadership or succor. Monasteries, with their communal living arrangements, suffered particularly high mortality rates, wiping out centuries of accumulated knowledge, tradition, and scholarly work. More fundamentally, the plague raises deeply uncomfortable theological questions that traditional dogma struggles to answer. If the disaster is truly divine punishment, as many church authorities vehemently claim, why do the virtuous and the sinful die alike, without distinction? Why do devout monks, pillars of piety, perish in droves, while seemingly impious laypeople miraculously survive? If fervent prayer and penance are the prescribed remedies, why do outbreaks often hit the very monasteries, places of constant prayer, the hardest of all? No truly satisfactory answers emerge from traditional theology, leaving a vacuum of faith and understanding. Instead, two divergent religious trends begin to develop. Some survivors, witnessing the horror, embrace an even more fervent, almost fanatical piety, seeing their survival as undeniable evidence of divine favor that demands grateful, unceasing devotion. Others, however, adopt a more skeptical, questioning attitude toward religious authorities who demonstrably failed to either explain or mitigate the catastrophe, their faith shaken to its core. This burgeoning questioning spirit, combined with the dramatic economic changes that unexpectedly give ordinary people more resources and a modicum of leisure time, creates incredibly fertile ground for the intellectual flowering that will eventually become the glorious Renaissance. When fewer hands are needed to produce society's basic necessities, more minds are freed to turn to the pursuits of art, philosophy, science, and literature. Education, previously restricted almost exclusively to the clergy and the nobility, gradually becomes available to a wider segment of society. Newly prosperous merchants and skilled artisans, keen to improve their station and their businesses, increasingly desire for their children to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic skills, not only useful for commerce, but also powerful markers of their rising social status. Small, informal schools begin to appear in towns and even larger villages, teaching practical knowledge alongside traditional religious instruction, slowly democratizing learning. The plague's brutal demographic shock also unexpectedly accelerates technological innovation. With labor now scarce and prohibitively expensive, techniques and inventions that save human effort become increasingly valuable, even indispensable. Water mills, long used solely for grinding grain, are ingeniously adapted for a host of new purposes, powering bellows for roaring blast furnaces, driving massive hammers for metalworking, fulling cloth, and even assisting in early printing endeavors. Printing technology, which will eventually revolutionize the spread of knowledge and ideas throughout Europe, receives early, crucial impetus from the post-plague labor shortage. Hand-copied manuscripts, each requiring months of a skilled scribe's meticulous time and effort, become prohibitively expensive when such workers can command premium wages. The immense economic pressure to find mechanical alternatives helps to drive the rapid development of movable type printing in the mid-15th century, forever changing communication. Perhaps most profoundly of all, the harrowing plague experience fundamentally shakes medieval Europe's complacent acceptance of unchanging tradition and rigid social order. When half the population dies in a few short, terrifying years, when venerable social hierarchies crumble and painfully rebuild in entirely new forms, when previously unquestioned authorities fail utterly to provide either protection or coherent explanation, The deeply ingrained idea that the world must remain as it has always been loses its ancient, powerful sway. After the Black Death, more people can, for the first time, truly imagine alternatives to existing arrangements, different ways of organizing work, new methods of distributing resources, novel structures of authority. Most of these nascent alternatives are never fully realized, and many that are implemented prove to be temporary disruptions. But the psychological barrier against the very idea of change itself weakens, cracks appearing in the ancient edifice of custom, creating vital space for the radical innovations in thought, technology, art, and social organization that will eventually transform medieval Europe into the early modern world. For the individuals actually living through these seismic changes, however, the experience is less about grand historical transformations and more about immediate, practical, daily adjustments. Thomas the Plowman doesn't intellectualize about the decline of feudalism. He focuses intensely on negotiating better terms with the manor steward so his family can eat better than they ever have before. Margareta the Weaver doesn't consider herself a pioneer of a gender revolution. She's simply using her hard-won skills to support herself and her surviving children after losing her beloved husband. Yet these countless individual adaptations, multiplied across millions of survivors throughout Europe, collectively, inexorably reshape society. Like water gradually, patiently wearing away solid stone, the countless small decisions made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances slowly erode and eventually transform the seemingly immutable structures of medieval life. Not all these changes are immediately positive, of course. The severe labor shortage that so benefits workers simultaneously creates significant hardship for many landowners. Some estates fail entirely, their owners simply unable to adapt to the brutal new economic realities. Churches, monasteries, and various charitable institutions, which had long depended on steady rents and generous donations, struggled desperately to maintain their operations with dramatically reduced income. Criminal activity, too, sees an unfortunate increase in some areas, as poorly supervised young men with improved incomes spend freely on alcohol and quickly find themselves embroiled in trouble. Abandoned properties in rural areas sometimes become havens for desperate outlaws and brigands. Urban governments worry constantly about maintaining order with their severely depleted watch forces and reduced tax bases. For several decades after the initial devastating plague outbreak, recurring, smaller epidemics continue to hit European communities, preventing significant population recovery and reinforcing, almost cementing, the profound economic and social changes the first great pandemic initiated. Not until the late 15th century does Europe's population finally begin sustained growth again, and it takes until the 17th century for many regions to reach their pre-plague population levels. This prolonged demographic depression means that the changes initially set in motion by the Black Death have ample time to become deeply entrenched, transforming temporary disruptions into new, enduring norms by the time population pressure eventually begins to reverse some of the initial economic advantages for common workers. Other, more fundamental aspects of medieval society have been permanently altered, irrevocably reshaped by the catastrophe. For the peasant family we have followed throughout our story, the decades after the plague bring a gradual yet profound improvement in their lives. Your older brother, who miraculously survived his terrifying bout with the disease, eventually takes over a neighboring farm, left vacant by a family with no survivors. What would have been utterly impossible before the plague, a peasant accumulating a significant landholding, becomes achievable in the depopulated, reshaped countryside. Your father, whose carpentry skills are now in incredibly high demand across the region, secures a lucrative contract to help rebuild the local church, which had suffered from years of neglect and disrepair during the plague years. The generous payment he receives allows him to add a second, spacious room to your family's modest cottage, and to finally replace the cold, damp dirt floor with warm, sturdy wooden planks. Small luxuries that would have seemed utterly unimaginable in the harsh, rigid pre-plague era. Your mother, resourceful and forward-thinking, teaches you and your sister to read, a rare and precious skill she herself learned while working as a servant in a wealthy merchant's household before her marriage. Before the plague, such knowledge would have had little practical value for peasant children, their lives bound to the land. But in the rapidly changing world of the late 14th century, literacy opens doors previously closed to those of humble birth, offering pathways to new lives. One crisp autumn evening, as your family gathers contentedly around the flickering hearth after the day's arduous work, your father speaks words that would have been utterly unthinkable a mere generation earlier. "Perhaps you could be a clerk," he says to you, nodding thoughtfully, his eyes filled with a new hope. "The abbey is seeking someone who can read and write to help with their records. The pay would be good, and the work is not hard on the body." Your brother laughs, not unkindly, but with a sense of genuine disbelief. "A clerk from our family? What would grandfather say to that?" The very idea of a peasant's child entering such an esteemed profession would indeed have seemed absurd, even sacrilegious, to earlier generations, for whom rigid social boundaries appeared as natural, as immutable, and as eternally fixed as the glittering stars themselves. Yet, as slumber finally claims you that night, the whisper of a new future begins to solidify in your mind. No longer an outlandish, impossible dream, it presents itself as a tangible, hard-won opportunity. This profound shift in perception, the ability for common folk to conceive of a life beyond their birthright, to aspire for more than their ancestors dared imagine, may well be the most enduring and radical legacy of the Black Death. It transcends the immediate seismic shifts in labor, wages, and the very fabric of society. It is the awakening of possibility itself. As the first faint blush of dawn paints the eastern sky, bringing this chapter of our journey to its quiet close, we leave you immersed in this pregnant moment of newfound potential. Your once familiar world, irrevocably shattered by loss beyond measure, is slowly, painstakingly being reforged into something entirely novel. The rigid, comforting certainties of the medieval age, those foundational beliefs that once dictated every aspect of existence, have been not merely questioned, but fundamentally challenged, even outright overthrown. What you, a survivor navigating this turbulent landscape, cannot yet fully grasp is the momentous historical precipice upon which you stand. The profound adaptations, the daring innovations, and the radical reconsiderations born from the plague's crucible will become the fertile soil for the blossoming of the Renaissance, the fervent upheavals of the Reformation, and ultimately, the intricate scaffolding of the modern world. These grand narratives, however, await our final night together, when we will chart the sprawling, centuries-long shadow cast by the Black Death, tracing its indelible influence across art, science, medicine, and the very structure of society, revealing how its echoes continue to sculpt our contemporary reality. As our immersive journey through the harrowing world of plague survivors draws to its close, it's time to pull back and survey the far broader landscape, to witness how the profound ripples unleashed by the Black Death have continued to expand outward through the currents of time, subtly yet profoundly sculpting the very contours of our present world. The indelible echoes of this medieval catastrophe resonate not only in the annals of history, but remarkably within our own bodies, in the foundational structures of our societies, and in the intricate ways we comprehend disease itself. Let us commence with what is arguably the most astonishing of these legacies: the biological inheritance meticulously passed down through the bloodlines of plague survivors. Cast your mind back to our discussion of the CCR5-delta-32 mutation, that singular genetic quirk, a silent, invisible shield that afforded some medieval Europeans an extraordinary measure of protection against the ravages of the plague. This minute yet monumental variation within the human DNA did not simply vanish when the plague's initial fury abated. Instead, it was meticulously carried forward, generation after generation, becoming increasingly enriched within the European gene pool. Those individuals fortunate enough to possess this mutation were, by definition, more likely to endure the pestilence, survive to reproductive age, and pass on their advantageous genes to their offspring. Now, let us fast forward an astonishing 600 years, propelling ourselves into the late 20th century. A new, terrifying pandemic unfurls its devastating banner across the globe. HIV/AIDS, relentlessly claiming millions of lives worldwide. In the desperate race to unravel the mysteries of this novel disease, medical researchers stumble upon a startling and inexplicable discovery. Certain individuals exhibit a natural, almost miraculous resistance to HIV infection, even after repeated and significant exposure. Further, exhaustive investigation finally unearths the astonishing truth. Many of these resilient individuals carry the very same CCR5-delta-32 mutation, the identical genetic variation that served as a lifesaver for their ancestors during the Black Death. The profound, almost poetic connection crystallizes once scientists meticulously chart the operational mechanisms of both diseases. Both the insidious Yersinia pestis bacterium, the agent of the Black Death, and the HIV virus exploit the CCR5 protein, using it as a cellular gateway, a vital port of entry into human cells. The delta-32 mutation, however, ingeniously alters this protein, effectively erecting an impenetrable barricade, slamming shut the very door these deadly pathogens attempt to breach. Thus, a genetic adaptation, meticulously selected by the brutal hand of one deadly disease in the 14th century, unexpectedly bestows an extraordinary protection against an entirely disparate and unimaginable threat in the 20th. This breathtaking discovery not only illuminated a hidden chapter of human evolution, but also catalyzed the development of groundbreaking new HIV drugs designed to specifically block the CCR5 receptor, thereby mimicking the protective action of this natural mutation. In a very profound and tangible sense, the distant echoes of medieval plague survivors have reached across the centuries to help safeguard and save countless lives in our modern era, their genetic legacy serving as an invaluable, indeed crucial, clue in humanity's ongoing battle against a disease they could never have possibly conceived. Yet, the profound biological reverberations of the plague extend far beyond the singular impact of this one mutation. The Black Death itself acted as an unparalleled, intensely brutal force of natural selection, likely reshaping and influencing myriad other facets of the human immune system within European populations. Today's descendants disproportionately trace their lineage back to the survivors, to those whose bodies, through a complex tapestry of genetic predispositions, proved more capable of withstanding the relentless onslaught of Yersinia pestis. Intriguingly, some scientists now theorize that certain autoimmune diseases, which are notably more prevalent in European populations, conditions where the body's own immune system, in a cruel twist of fate, mistakenly turns upon and attacks its own healthy tissues, might represent an unintended, bittersweet consequence of this severe evolutionary culling. Our medieval ancestors survived the plague precisely because their immune responses were exceptionally vigorous, fiercely reactive. That very same heightened, aggressive reactivity, however, may inadvertently predispose their modern descendants to conditions such as rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's disease, or multiple sclerosis, where the immune system becomes dangerously overactive and misdirected. These fascinating, intricate biological connections between our distant past and our immediate present serve as a potent reminder. Pandemics are not merely episodic events that kill vast numbers and then conveniently vanish from the pages of history. Rather, they are profound evolutionary forces, irrevocably reshaping the very genetic makeup of the surviving population, etching changes into the human genome that can endure for centuries, even millennia, long after the immediate crisis has faded into memory. The Black Death's social and economic transformations proved to be equally, if not more, enduring and far-reaching. While the immediate chaotic aftermath, the dramatic labor shortages, the unprecedented wage increases, and the fleeting bursts of social mobility we examined on a previous night, did eventually subside as Europe's population slowly, painstakingly began to recover, certain fundamental shifts were irrevocably etched into the societal landscape, becoming permanent fixtures. Consider, for instance, the deeply entrenched institution of serfdom, a system that had, for generations preceding the plague, effectively tethered millions of peasants to the land, their lives governed by hereditary obligations to their feudal lords. In Western Europe, this ancient, seemingly immutable system never truly recovered from the cataclysmic disruption wrought by the Black Death. Despite the desperate, often brutal attempts by landlords to reimpose their old restrictions, to reassert their traditional authority, the stark demographic reality of a drastically depopulated continent irrevocably worked against them. Land, once a precious commodity, remained relatively abundant, while skilled and unskilled labor, once plentiful, became an acutely scarce resource for centuries. This unprecedented scarcity dramatically inverted the power dynamic, granting workers a newfound leverage that systematically, albeit gradually, eroded the very foundations of feudal obligations. By the waning years of the Middle Ages, serfdom had largely withered away in pivotal regions such as England, France, and the Low Countries, replaced by a diverse array of rental arrangements. These new systems, such as tenant farming, afforded peasants significantly greater personal freedom, allowing them to lease land, move, and even choose their employers. While they still toiled upon the land, they did so increasingly as tenants, paying rent for their plots, rather than as serfs, shackled by hereditary duties of labor and subservience that had defined their ancestors' lives for centuries. Eastern Europe, however, charted a distinctly different and ultimately tragic course. There, a powerful and less challenged nobility successfully managed to not only reimpose, but often brutally strengthen the bonds of serfdom in the aftermath of the plague. This oppressive resurgence gave rise to what historians term the Second Serfdom, a system that would tragically endure, binding millions to the land well into the 19th century. This profound divergence in social systems between Western and Eastern Europe, one slowly gravitating toward greater, albeit hard-won, freedom for its common people, the other spiraling toward ever more rigid and entrenched control, would profoundly influence the subsequent historical, economic, and political development of these respective regions for centuries to come. laying the groundwork for many of the inequalities that persisted into the modern era. Beyond the temporal realm of economics and social order, the Black Death also dramatically accelerated fundamental and irreversible changes in the very fabric of religious life. The monolithic Catholic Church, which for centuries had stood as the undisputed arbiter of medieval intellectual, spiritual, and moral existence, suddenly found its formidable authority deeply shaken and profoundly challenged in the plague's immediate and lasting aftermath. Heart-wrenching questions arose from the depths of widespread suffering. Why did fervent prayers go so agonizingly unanswered? Why did solemn religious processions, once believed to ward off evil, fail so spectacularly to halt the relentless march of the disease? And perhaps most unsettling of all, why did devout, pious monks and saintly priests perish in the same harrowing agony as unrepentant sinners, seemingly without divine distinction? These agonizing queries, echoing from countless pulpits and dying breaths, began to carve deep, unsettling cracks in the once impregnable edifice of unquestioning medieval faith. These nascent fissures, born of incomprehensible loss and spiritual confusion, would only widen and deepen in the centuries that followed, ultimately paving the way for monumental shifts. The fervent and transformative Protestant Reformation of the 16th century, with its radical challenge to Catholic papal authority and its revolutionary emphasis on individual interpretation of Scripture, found exceptionally fertile ground within a European population already profoundly predisposed to question religious orthodoxy and institutional power. While the complex tapestry of the Reformation undeniably had numerous political, economic, and theological causes, astute historians invariably discern profound echoes of the Plague era's widespread disillusionment and spiritual yearning in the readiness of millions to bravely, or perhaps desperately, break with centuries of hallowed tradition and established religious order. The Plague had, in effect, prepared the spiritual landscape for revolution. Remarkably, the Plague's pervasive impact even permeated the very sinews of language, leaving indelible marks upon our modern English vocabulary that persist to this day. When we utter the word quarantine, we are unwittingly invoking a direct linguistic echo of the Black Death experience. The term is derived from the Venetian Italian quarantina giorni, meaning 40 days, precisely the period during which ships, often suspected of carrying the pestilence, were rigorously compelled to remain isolated in the bustling harbors of Venice during plague outbreaks. This practice, born of desperate necessity, laid the foundation for modern disease containment. Similarly, consider the contemporary phrase, having a deadline. While its more immediate origin lies in American Civil War prison camps, where it referred to a literal line beyond which guards were authorized to shoot escaping prisoners, the underlying concept of a stringent, unyielding boundary echoes the rigorous demarcations drawn around plague-stricken houses or entire quarantined areas. These were lines of life and death, beyond which movement was forbidden to prevent the further spread of contagion. And then there are the seemingly innocuous childhood rhymes, which, in their innocent simplicity, may harbor deeper, darker memories of the plague. The familiar lines, ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down, have been interpreted by some cultural historians and folklorists as a chilling, albeit veiled reference to plague symptoms and the desperate attempts to combat them. Ring around the rosy is thought to describe the characteristic rosy rash or buboes, swollen lymph nodes, that appeared on plague victims. Pocket full of posies alludes to the aromatic herbs and sweet-smelling flowers carried by people, not for aesthetic pleasure, but to ward off the perceived foul air, miasma, believed to cause the disease, or simply to mask the stench of death and decay. Ashes, ashes, or a tissue, has been linked to cremation, or the sneezing fits often associated with the pneumonic form of plague, while we all fall down speaks to the inevitable, widespread death. Though scholars vigorously debate the definitive origins of this particular rhyme, the very persistence of such an interpretation powerfully illustrates how deeply the haunting imagery and existential trauma of the plague may be embedded within the collective cultural memory, passed down through generations, even when its explicit meaning is lost. Perhaps one of the most fundamental and lasting transformations wrought by the Black Death was in humanity's very relationship with, and understanding of, disease itself. Prior to the plague, prevailing medical theories largely attributed illness to either divine punishment for sins, an imbalance of the four bodily humors, or the noxious emanations of bad air, miasma. The concept of contagion, as we understand it today, the invisible transfer of disease-causing agents from person to person, was virtually non-existent or poorly grasped. However, the plague's brutally efficient and terrifyingly evident pattern of spread, unfailingly moving along vital trade routes, inexorably passing from person to person through close contact, made it utterly impossible to ignore the contagious nature of at least some diseases. Faced with such overwhelming empirical evidence, medieval communities, driven by desperation and pragmatic necessity, began to forge innovative responses that, while not based on germ theory, which would not emerge for another 5 centuries, nonetheless incorporated remarkably effective public health measures. Ships arriving from infected ports were rigorously quarantined. Entire households afflicted by the pestilence were isolated, their doors often marked with a stark red cross, and the bodies of plague victims, along with their contaminated belongings, were frequently burned to prevent further spread. Cities began to appoint dedicated public health boards, endowed with extraordinary powers during outbreaks, effectively establishing the nascent principles of epidemic management that would profoundly influence public health practices for centuries to come. These pragmatic approaches, painstakingly developed through bitter, agonizing experience rather than scientific understanding, undoubtedly saved countless lives in subsequent plague outbreaks across Europe. By the time the last major European plague epidemic struck the bustling port city of Marseille in 1720, authorities had accumulated centuries of hard-won knowledge. They swiftly implemented stringent cordons sanitaires, military-enforced quarantines around affected areas, strict quarantines for incoming vessels, and meticulous monitoring protocols that successfully limited the outbreak largely to that city and its immediate environs, preventing a wider catastrophe. While such measures, tragically, came far too late for the millions who perished in the initial, devastating pandemic of the 14th century, the institutional memory and knowledge gained from the Black Death experience proved invaluable, not only mitigating later recurrences of plague, but also profoundly informing responses to other epidemic diseases. When cholera, a different kind of microbial terror, swept across Europe in the 19th century, pioneering public health officials consciously drew upon these established plague management traditions to contain its spread, initially imperfectly, but with increasing effectiveness as scientific understanding gradually improved. Indeed, the Black Death's enduring legacy extends directly into the realm of modern pandemic management. Many of the now familiar approaches universally employed during recent global health crises, such as the COVID-19 outbreaks, including large-scale quarantines, travel restrictions, diligent contact tracing, and the isolation of infected individuals have their conceptual roots firmly planted in methods first developed centuries ago in direct response to the Black Death. Even the perennial, often agonizing tension between economic impacts and the imperative of public health measures, a debate so familiar in our own time, echoes the heated medieval discussions about whether to bravely close city gates and markets during plague outbreaks, weighing survival against starvation. Perhaps most profoundly, the harrowing, epoch-defining experience of the Black Death fundamentally reshaped how humans conceptualize and respond to catastrophe itself. Medieval Europeans, certainly, inhabited a world where sudden disaster loomed large and seemed ever-present. Local wars, recurrent famines, and smaller, localized disease outbreaks regularly claimed lives and shattered communities. Yet the sheer, unimaginable scale and terrifying speed of the Black Death surpassed anything within living memory, or, indeed, any recorded history. This terrifying encounter with near-apocalyptic mortality, this direct confrontation with the potential annihilation of civilization, forced a profound, collective psychological adjustment upon the survivors. Communities that miraculously endured learned an invaluable, albeit agonizing, lesson. They could, in fact, withstand previously unimaginable loss, grieve deeply, and yet somehow still continue. Individuals, pushed to their absolute limits, discovered inner reserves of resilience, courage, and adaptability they might never have known they possessed. Societies as a whole developed an institutional memory for crisis management and honed adaptive practices for confronting future calamities. This deep-seated capacity for resilience, the ability to bounce back, to repair, to persist in the face of overwhelming adversity, remains, to this very day, one of humanity's most invaluable and defining assets. Throughout the long, often tumultuous, tapestry of human history, communities have repeatedly faced disasters that, at the time, must have seemed utterly insurmountable. Yet, almost inexplicably, life, in its tenacious drive, finds a way to continue. People mourn their dead with profound sorrow, yes, but then they gather their strength, rebuild their shattered settlements, adapt their cherished practices, and inexorably move forward, carrying the indelible memory of what was lost, while courageously creating something entirely new from what remains. We witness this enduring pattern repeated after virtually every major catastrophe that has befallen our species, from the sudden, fiery burial of Pompeii by Vesuvius to the devastating earthquake that leveled Lisbon in 1755. From the horrific global sweep of the 1918 influenza pandemic to more recent natural disasters and novel disease outbreaks. The Black Death, perhaps the most extreme and widespread example of such calamitous mortality in recorded human history, stands as a testament to this remarkable human capacity to endure, to adapt, and ultimately to persevere and continue the journey of life. This recognition of human resilience is not, and never should be, an attempt to minimize the unfathomable suffering inflicted by such events. The plague brought with it pain beyond imagining, savagely tearing apart families, obliterating entire communities, and prematurely ending millions of unique lives, each containing a universe of experience, dreams, and unfulfilled potential. No silver lining of social change or biological adaptation, however significant, can ever justify or ameliorate such colossal loss. Yet, by understanding how humanity collectively weathered this unparalleled storm, we gain invaluable perspective on our own intrinsic capacity to confront the daunting challenges of the present and the uncertainties of the future. Climate change, newly emerging infectious diseases, rapid technological disruptions. Our modern world is hardly short of existential threats. The profound history of the Black Death serves as a powerful, sobering reminder that previous generations faced their own seemingly insurmountable crises, yet they too found ways to persist, to rebuild, and to continue. For the individual plague survivors whose deeply personal stories we have followed these past nights, such grand historical patterns and sweeping intellectual analyses would have held little meaning compared to the immediate, visceral reality of their lived experience. Thomas the plowman, shrewdly negotiating for better working conditions in the labor-starved aftermath, was not consciously contemplating the long-term decline of feudalism. Elizabeth Hancock, bravely burying her family members on the wind-swept hillside above Eyam, could not possibly have conceived that her genetic legacy might someday provide a protective shield for her descendants against an entirely different 20th century disease. Yet it was precisely the accumulated weight of these countless individual experiences, these myriad small adaptations and courageous acts of perseverance, that collectively forged the sweeping, transformative changes that reshaped medieval society into something profoundly new. This, indeed, is often the subtle yet powerful engine of history. Not solely through the conscious decisions of great leaders or dramatic, singular turning points, but through the incremental yet compounding effects of millions of ordinary people responding to extraordinary, often terrifying circumstances as best they humanly can. As our shared story gently draws to a close and the promise of sleep beckons, imagine once more that humble medieval village we first visited, now a full generation after the plague's devastating passage. The population has begun its slow, vital recovery, with new children's laughter echoing through the sun-drenched streets, and young families once again occupying cottages that stood empty, mournful for years. The survivors, now the venerable elders of the community, carry within them the vivid, indelible memory of what transpired, both the unimaginable horrors they witnessed and the profound, transformative changes they, through sheer will and necessity, helped to forge in the aftermath. They could never have known, of course, how their individual and collective experience would reverberate and echo through centuries, subtly influencing everything from genetic inheritance to complex social structures, from the nuances of artistic expression to the pragmatic approaches to public health. They simply lived their lives as best they humanly could, in circumstances they never chose, displaying that extraordinary human capacity for adaptation, perseverance, and stubborn hope that has carried our species through countless, seemingly insurmountable challenges. And perhaps that, above all, is the most comforting and sustaining thought to carry with us into our dreams, that we too, like those resilient plague survivors, possess deep, untapped reservoirs of fortitude, resilience, and adaptability, qualities we may not even recognize until circumstances, unforgiving and demanding, call them forth. That life, for all its inherent fragility and occasional brutality, exhibits a persistent, almost miraculous tendency to continue, to rebuild, to innovate, and to find entirely new paths forward when old ones are irrevocably blocked. The Black Death survivors, in their wildest imaginings, could never have conceived of our modern world, with its breathtaking medical technologies, instant global communication, and sophisticated scientific understanding of the very bacterium that wrought such suffering upon them. Nor can we, in our own time, fully envision the world our descendants will inhabit generations hence. But like those courageous medieval ancestors, we too move forward, carrying both the wounds and the wisdom of past catastrophes, and the profound insights gained from surviving them, contributing, in ways both small and grand, to the ceaselessly unfolding human story. Sleep well, then, knowing you are an integral part of this long, unbroken continuum of human experience, intimately connected to those who came before and those who will inevitably follow. Each generation, in its own time, faces its unique trials. Each courageously finds its own ways to endure, to adapt, and ultimately to continue the remarkable, improbable journey of our species through the boundless expanse of time. This unbroken chain of being, stretching from the dawn of consciousness to the farthest reaches of imagined futures, underscores a profound truth. We are not merely fleeting individuals, but intricate, indispensable threads in a magnificent, ever-unfurling tapestry. The echoes of ancient struggles resonate with the urgent clamor of present-day challenges, each demanding not just mere survival, but also the tenacious preservation of that indomitable spirit which truly defines us. It is within these crucibles of adversity that the deepest wells of human ingenuity, compassion, and unwavering hope are perpetually tapped, forging resilience anew with every passing epoch. And so, as the cosmic clock relentlessly ticks forward, we are profoundly reminded of the extraordinary privilege and solemn responsibility inherent in this grand endeavor. Our collective legacy is not simply the sum of our material achievements, but the vibrant, enduring testament to an unwavering will to not just exist, but to persistently strive, to deeply understand, and to endlessly dream, thereby propelling the improbable narrative of humankind ever onward, an eternal, ever-brightening flicker against the vast, patient canvas of eternity.